Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Marielle Mostello, and I am a first-year doctorate student here at Nazareth College studying physical therapy. This is my fourth year working at the Hickey Center as the program and social media coordinator. So our mission at the Hickey Center and the International Institute of Islamic Thought Chair for Interfaith Studies is to promote understanding and appreciation of differences through education and dialogue. This year, our focus is on how interfaith dialogue can inform and challenge the consciousness of members of the Nazareth community and the greater Rochester, New York area to stand up for racial justice in peaceful ways. So we ask that you submit your questions today to our panelists through the chat box and keep your microphones on mute, as our students will be moderating the question and answer section of the discussion today. This seminar is being recorded to use for educational purposes at Nazareth College. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon. My name is Louise, and I am a graduate student here at Nazareth College studying higher education student affairs administration. This will be my second year working at the Hickey Center as one of the graduate assistants. This afternoon, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Angela Sims from the Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School as our keynote speaker to discuss healing racial inequalities and injustices from an interfaith perspective. She'll be joined by a panel of local religious leaders who each have a background in interfaith dialogue. Reverend Lawrence Hargrave, Rabbi Peter Stein, and Dr. Irshad Altheimer. Dr. Sims is the first woman president of Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School and the first president to lead CRCDS at its new location at 320 North Goodman Street in Rochester, New York. She is the author and co-author of several books and is the recipient of an array of grants and fellowships. She has been featured on Religion and Ethics News Weekly and in articles in the Dallas Morning News, the Baptist Standard, and the New York Times. Prior to pursuing her theological work, Dr. Sims served in the business field, skills that have proven essential to her administrative work. We are honored to have her here today as our keynote speaker. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sims to the seminar.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you, President Paul and Dr. Shafiq, for your warm welcome. It is good to be in this space with each of you, even during these moments of deep concern for both our local communities, our nation, and our world. Dr. Shafiq sort of asked me to talk a little bit about race in preparing for the conversation that will follow with both the panelists and with each of you. So while I did not confirm on what date Dr. Shafiq and his team began planning this series of seminars to challenge American consciousness to stand up for justice in peaceful ways, I am certain that, like us, he and others recognize the names of at least one of these persons: David McAtee, George Perry Floyd, Michael Brent, Charles Ramos, Breonna Taylor, Manuel Manny Elijah Ellis, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Eric Gardner, Michael Brown. To this list, we add the name Daniel Prude. An August 31, 2020 report published by Statista Research Department shows that, and I quote, "Sadly, the trend of fatal police shootings in the United States seems to only be increasing, with a total 661 civilians having been shot, 123 of whom were Black, as of August 30th. This also translates to 19% of Blacks being shot, in contrast to Blacks comprising approximately 13% of the US's total population. The report also goes on to note that the rate of fatal police shootings among Black Americans was much higher than that for any other ethnicity, standing at 31 fatal shootings per million of the population as of August 2020, close quote. Given the history of policing in this country, when Black bodies are perceived as lethal, who determines what constitutes peaceful resistance? After all, respectability politics, a set of beliefs holding that conformity to prescribed mainstream standards of appearance and behavior will protect a person who is part of a marginalized group, especially a Black person, from prejudices and systemic injustice. Respectability politics does not prevent Blacks from being victims of police profiling and violence. When there is a history of nonviolent protests being met with legally authorized excessive lethal use of force, how many live streamed and police camera videos are needed to convince some people that Black lives do matter? At the same time, to whom are police accountable and responsible when one of their own can kill with impunity? When increased calls to defund policing through a reallocation of resources to communities as a means by which to address issues of inequity and injustice is met with denial about systemic problems in policing, what is required to deal with a gross level of miseducation about life in these disunited states of America that is sustained by an unquestioned alliance to a white supremacist worldview that some seek to maintain by any means necessary. The concept of race has been constructed in the United States in such a way that persons who self-identify as Caucasian often do not think of themselves as being raced. White becomes an assumed normative standard against which all others are measured. As Willie Jennings, Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Africana Studies at Yale Divinity School, and author of The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origin of Race, writes, and I quote, "Whiteness was and is a way of being in the world and a way of seeing the world at the same time. It was nurtured and grew inside of Christianity, its voice mimicking Christianity, saying sweetly, this is what it means to be Christian," close quote. Because whiteness has meant better treatment under the law, the process of excluding group after group from whiteness was at the same time a process by which to establish those who were not white as inferior, while those whose whiteness was upheld by the rulings were established as superior. This concept of race is a social construction and not a biological determinant. In many ways, this concept of race in the US functions as an ideological fabrication. Race equals the justification for domination and enslavement in all of its varied manifestations. Race equals a categorizing method. Jennings encourages us to consider the following. Number one, whiteness is not the opposite of Blackness. Number two, whiteness is not a given. Number three, whiteness is a goal. 4, whiteness is a way of imagining the world moving around you. 5, whiteness is a way of imagining oneself as the central facilitating reality of the world, the reality that makes sense of the world, that interprets, organizes, and narrates the world. And 6, whiteness is having the power to realize and sustain that imagination. As noted by Stephen B. Bevins, Emeritus Professor of Mission and Culture at Catholic Theological Union, these claims about whiteness are informed by a reality that, and I quote, "The understandings of race that are dominant are grounded in European history of expansion in which Europeans spilled over into and claimed the right to own other people, other races, their land, resources, and in some cases, the people themselves," close quote. As a Christian social ethicist, I am reminded that in this moment in which we find ourselves, individually and collectively, there is a need to acknowledge that for many, COVID-19 functions as a painful reminder of income and wealth disparities, human invisibility and disposability of the working poor, neo forms of school segregation, increased isolation, inadequate health care, white supremacist toxicity, rampant police brutality in one too many jurisdictions, and perceived entitlement and gross self-centeredness that has the potential to jeopardize the lives of many. In this COVID-19 moment, we need to be mindful of the manner in which language may be deployed intentionally to inhibit one's ability to name injustice. After all, it has been said that naming a problem correctly in unambiguous terms is a prerequisite to healing. Persons committed to justice cannot afford to ignore the fact that the evils of racism, poverty, and militarism were pre-COVID-19 societal realities. I take you back to the 2008 presidential campaign, when media pundits played a selective soundbite, void of any attempt to contextualize the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah A. Wright's 2003 sermonic declaration, God Damn America, in what is surely among one of his most relevant messages for a people who know from personal experience what it is like to live with one's back, literally and figuratively, against the wall. Wright skillfully exegeted the biblical text to remind worshipers at Trinity United Methodist Church of Christ in Chicago, Illinois, of what can occur when persons who self-identify as followers of Jesus the Christ are not mindful of consequences associated with confusing God and government. The vitriolic responses to this now pastor emeritus of a church that self-identifies as unashamedly Christian and unapologetically Black continue to serve as timely reminders that the killing of unarmed Black persons at the hands of known and unknown persons is neither new nor an anomaly. Rather, the ever-present threat of danger in the US for persons of African descent is a poignant reminder that white domestic terrorism is etched into the DNA of this oligarchic republic, at risk of becoming a kleptocracy that markets itself as a bastion of democracy. Historically, architects of a culture where pervasive evil masqueraded behind sheets benefited from systems designed to keep Blacks with their hands lifted up, not in praise, but with an eerie awareness that death at the hands of persons employed to protect and serve was an ever-present reality. With the election of Barack Hussein Obama as the 44th president of the United States of America, many were quick to proclaim the advent of a post-racial society. This declaration suggests a pseudo-ideal that both disregards the uniqueness of humanity and describes a form of absolution that exempts certain persons and systems from past, present, and future acts of racialized violence. To imply that race does not matter exacerbates, as Mardessa Corbin, a participant in my Remembering Lynching Oral History project, explained, and I quote, the reluctance to talk about anything that is racial. Because in the Deep South, and probably also in a lot of areas in the Western states, those that border Canada like the Dakotas, there still exists a lot of racial prejudice. And the conversation on race is not an easy conversation for most people, close quote. 50 plus years after Bloody Sunday was televised around the world, and now a few days since the Monday release of Rochester Chief of Police LaRon D. Singletary's April 10th email regarding the medical examiner's ruling Prude's death as a homicide, and this excerpt from a New York Times article updated today that notes the following. We certainly do not want people to misinterpret the officer's actions and conflate this incident with any recent killings of unarmed Black men by law enforcement nationally, a deputy Rochester police chief wrote in an email to his boss. That would simply be a false narrative and could create animosity and potentially violent blowback in this community as a result. His advice was clear. Don't release the body camera footage to the Prude family's lawyer. The police chief replied minutes later, I totally agree. Although I have not seen a copy of this document obtained from City Records Access, non-disclosure of facts erodes trust that candid conversations about intersectional realities can be a catalyst for life-affirming sustained change. Rather than name racism as a national sin, there's a greater tendency, as Corbin opined, to sweep it under the rug than to talk about it. Clearly, the continued deaths of unarmed Black persons at the hands of police and others counter any claims that silence is an antidote to diffuse a neo-lynching culture that is based on a constructed ideology of white supremacy. At the same time, I acknowledge, as did Corbin, that those who confront government-sanctioned practices of terror do so often at great personal and communal risk. Despite a national narrative of truth and justice for all, Corbin rightly noted that how we respond to race and violence, and I quote, has a lot to do with fear. And the fear is not necessarily a physical kind, even though that does exist to a degree. You have a fear of retaliation by economic means. The suppression is still there. And now, instead of using the physical, we use the economic sweep, and it can be so effectively used on both white and Black until it just makes it uncomfortable. Plus, you never know to whom you're talking, and so it makes for reluctance in conversation. Also, it's really difficult to face that because, in a sense, you feel a coward because you don't face it. It's more comfortable to let it slide, and that's what we do. We take the more comfortable route, close quote. We find ourselves increasingly confronted with racial issues that are cloaked in ambiguous national jargon, held in tension and contrasted against contextually informed interpretations and applications. If racial profiling, excessive police force, and occupied neighborhoods are any indicators of the United States moral barometer, we are, as Corbin stated, and I quote, really in trouble as a country until we can see how the racial divide is hurting our growth, close quote. For Corbin and other Black elders who shared their memories of lynching and a lynching culture in the US with me, the growth to which they refer is not measured in terms of economic profit and loss. Rather, growth is determined by an individual and collective ability to recognize and respect the full human dignity of another person. It is a commitment to dismantle systems designed specifically to use violence to beget violence in a manner that disrupts and often silences narrative regarding foundational practices traceable to this nation's initial occupation of this land. Scholars of color have long made connections between the religion of Christianity as practiced by many in the US and the formation of race and racism. Yet very few white scholars take seriously the history of white supremacy and contemporary privileges it bestows upon its followers. In Make America Great Again, Racialized Religious Rhetoric and the Performance of Whiteness, Eric Weed provides a theohistorical overview of the foundations of white supremacy. Weed's introduction is informed by a question that guides his research. He asks, why a religion of white supremacy? I appreciate his self-disclosed moment of cognitive dissonance in which he reveals that, and I quote, when I saw the workings of white supremacy in the past and present, I saw myself, close quote. At the same time, from this personal acknowledgement emerges for me a series of questions or concerns about race. For instance, how does an unconscious recognition of oneself contribute to a perpetuation of stratifications of acceptable and unacceptable behavior in such a way that implicit biases can be minimized or disregarded altogether? When behavior is viewed from a rhetorical perspective, I am not surprised at all by an at least public distancing by some persons who self-identify as white from persons deemed to be extremists, though upon a close examination, one may find more in common than an alliance based exclusively on a socially constructed form of racial identity. After all, there are members of white supremacy groups who simultaneously present themselves as Christian. Whether one chooses to name or not themselves as co-religionists of an inherited tradition, this reluctance to understand whiteness as a multifaceted moral dilemma tends to deflect attention away from doing a deep interrogation of the very subject that is under investigation by Weed: white supremacy as a religion, white supremacy as a worldview that is intricately connected to meanings of ontology, the way one understands oneself in relation to the world and one's being. In this regard, Weed is absolutely correct that whites can, and I quote, step back from the messiness of race at any moment, close quote, and not name racism as a national sin and racist practices as evil. It is this form of orchestrated privilege that lends itself to endorsing an uncritical examination of racialized religious rhetoric and the performance of whiteness as encoded in an import to make America great again that unwittingly conflates white supremacy as an expression of Christianity. This racialized religious performance, encouraged by the person who holds the highest elected office in this country, permeates public spaces. This hate-infused enactment is a powerful reminder that the God of white supremacists is no more the God of justice-seeking persons than it was the God of enslaved persons of African descent. I am very much aware that for many whites, an ability to maintain familial relationships is contingent upon an ability to make a distinction between the religious and the political. Yet the religion of white supremacy in the US prompts me to consider what is at stake when white people refuse to divest themselves from myths that are foundational to that which they have come to accept as normative. In other words, how does one come to terms with an ontological, epistemological worldview that is predicated on a false construction? What values are essential to guide a deconstructive process of whiteness that will inform the ongoing work of construction and reconstruction? As a way forward, this is work that must be done by whites on behalf of whites, as Eric Weed, Jennifer Harvey, Richard T. Hughes, Robert P. Jones, and others seek to make a distinction between the religion of white supremacy, white supremacist Christianity, and Christianity. Given my own research on lynching and a culture of lynching in the US, I'm intrigued by Weed's use of Tillich as a framework by which to analyze white supremacy as constructed and operative in the United States. Concepts of place and space, when understood from a perspective of occupation, enslavement, internment, with each dependent upon xenophobic infused rhetoric, cloaked in religious jargon, and enforced by legal mandates, are helpful in analyzing that which functions as ultimate. In this regard, whiteness is centered as an ideology that functions as the chief barometer by which meaning is discerned. From this performance that situates whiteness as an epistemological site of discovery, the demonic operates subliminally through bifurcated processes that result in a form of religious hybridity from which few are willing to disengage. While we suggest, and I quote, white supremacist Christianity has taken possession of the US ethos, close quote, I question whether it might be more appropriate to note that white supremacist Christianity is the very foundation of the US ethos. It is a religion that at its core is characterized by deception, exploitation, entitlement, and fear of the other. White supremacist Christianity's existence is contingent always upon a performance of race that negates the full humanity of others. In the shadow of 21st century lynching trees, individuals who acknowledge the full humanity of all people are invited to seek creative and life-affirming ways to give voice to atrocities that daily put the lives of non-cisgendered heterosexual white boys and men, and those who choose to pass as such, at risk of murder, deportation, or other acts of violence. For such a time as this, an urgent question is not necessarily where is the divine in the midst of this entrenched, pervasive evil. Rather, a serious concern is how to experience the divine in such a way that life and not death is the final word. As Weed concludes in his analysis of white supremacist Christianity, and I quote, the image of the white Christ is a representation of the belief in the sacredness of whiteness within American society. As such, the sacred place of whiteness is ensured by eternally connecting it to the freedom of the citizen, close quote. We are at a crossroads in this country where we do not have the luxury to ignore cultural realities. Since Rochester has a violent crime rate that is nearly quadruple the national average, as well as a personal and property crime rate that exceeds the US average, I contend that people of faith have a moral responsibility to examine how their theological positions can and should inform policy at local, state, regional, and national levels. In an era characterized increasingly by white domestic terrorism that leaves in its wake a new path of the slaughtered, for which there appears to be no immediate end. For such a time as now, interfaith leaders are called to speak truth to power and to the communities with which they are affiliated. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sim. Good afternoon. My name is Miriam Cisse, and I'm a senior here at the Hickey Center, studying public health. This is my first year working at the Hickey Center as the undergrad intern. This afternoon, I'm honored to welcome our panelists as local religious leader with expertise in interfaith dialogue, Reverend Lawrence Hargrave, Rabbi Peter Stein, and Dr. Irshad Altheimer. Each will give a brief presentation from their religious tradition approach to racism, racial discrimination and injustice. Our first panelist is Reverend Louis Hargrave, who was nurtured in his childhood in the historic First Shiloh Baptist Church in Buffalo, New York. He is an ordained American Baptist minister and has served as a minister of mission support and the co-intern executive minister of the American Baptist Church of the Rochester, Geneseo region. He has been involved in ecumenical and interfaith work for over 20 years and recently retired after serving 3.5 years as a pastor for outreach and connectional ministry as the Ashbury First United Methodist Church. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Hargrave to our panel.
Good afternoon, and it's Hargrave. Thank you, Dr. Sims, for your excellent presentation. I look to approach my comments by offering reflections of my personal life. And since I'm the oldest of the presenters, I think, my personal history goes back a little further. But in growing up, I grew up in the Baptist church, and I always had a question because the church that I was a member of, First Shiloh Baptist Church in Buffalo, New York, was an all-Black congregation. We were members of the American Baptist Churches USA denomination, which is a multiracial denomination. And we also were members of the National Baptist Convention USA, which is virtually all Black. And early on, I did not understand why we were members of two different denominations. But as I grew older, I came to a better understanding. And some of that was not just because of church. Some of that was what I found outside of church. I was raised in the Buffalo Public Schools, and the Buffalo Public School system, when I started out, my early classes I was part of a racial minority. And then in elementary school, we moved to another area, and the classes that I had in school were all people of color, all looked like me in one way or another. And then when I went into the 6th grade, we moved to a neighborhood where I was one of 2 students in the classroom, 2 students of color in the classroom. So that meant that the other roughly 30 students were all white. And as a 6th grader, I outperformed all of the other students. And so my teacher, who was white, stood me up in the front of the class and said to the classroom, that Lawrence is a credit to his race. And Here, many years later, I remember it like it was yesterday because it got me to thinking. Did she say that because I wasn't supposed to perform as well as the other students? Did she say that because she was holding me up as an example of what someone who looked like me should be? And so what it did was it started me, and really what has been a lifelong quest for better understanding. I went to junior high school, and the class that we had was 1/3 of us were people of color, 2/3 were white. And then I went to a high school and my undergraduate and college, and I was part of what was less than 2% of people of color. In those experiences, I got education in school, but I also had education outside of school. In my high school, what I found was that the white students, some of whom were in the same junior high that we were in, didn't associate with people who look like me. And, for me, by that time, we were parts of different neighborhoods. But what I did find was, and I find that just in terms of going to high school reunions and sort of finding out that the neighborhood that I came from, the students who I went to school with, their view of my neighborhood was that the result of growing up in that neighborhood was you would wind up either dead or in prison. And again, this is hindsight looking back from, comments that they wrote, not comments that, they told me. But the other part of that was, as a student in high school, I had at least one job, sometimes two jobs while I was going to school. And I also belonged to the YMCA. And that was, one of the things that my father had in terms of education in school, education in church, education in the community. And I can remember one Saturday night after playing basketball and then keeping score of the team that played after us and running home. And I get to my home and run up the stairs, and my mother hears me, and she lets me in. I'm 14 years old. And right behind me pushes in a police officer with his gun out and a wild look in his eyes, a white police officer. And a look that, that there's a saying that if looks could kill, I wouldn't be here. But he had his gun out, so it was more than just a look. And then it could have been seconds or minutes later that his partner came in behind him and said, no, it wasn't him. What it was, he saw a black person running, a black male running. And he had, I guess, had some kind of encounter with some other black young people and thought I was one of them and was ready to kill me, I'm sure. The fact that his partner came in right away saved me, I suppose, but they left, never apologized to me, surely never apologized to my mother, who was at once hysterical about what happened. And my mother passed away without getting that apology. Because of my earlier experiences, I tried to come to a better understanding in terms of understanding, how we reached this thing of where a person who looks like me, no matter how successful you are viewed as less than. And so, after college, I worked in corporate life also. I was in sales and marketing with Procter & Gamble. And while I was there, we started some conversations on race, trying to, for me, yes, trying to get an understanding, but also trying to help other people understand. And so we had some success in terms of those conversations. I actually, had the opportunity to bring some of, my white colleagues to an African-American theater, got a view of a play on Malcolm X. We went to an African-American nightclub. We went to a place to have dinner afterwards, just as an exposure, because, one of the things I found is that not only do we live in different worlds, but we have different world experiences and we have different expectations of what life is supposed to be. I left corporate life and became a student at Colgate Rochester Divinity School. Even while I was in corporate life, I was involved in interfaith studies and dialogue. I was involved in the Commission on Christian-Jewish Relations, Commission on Christian-Muslim Relations, the Interfaith Forum, the Interfaith Alliance, Greater Rochester Community of Churches. While I was with Greater Rochester Community of Churches, then President Gordon Webster and I put together a presentation. We invited Dr. Cornel West to Rochester. This was in September of 1998. And he spoke to an overflow crowd at Enon Baptist Church, really talking about his book, Race Matters. And Race Matters, basically talks about how in this country, race does matter. It was an exciting event. We had dinner and dialogue before he spoke. He spoke for over an hour, and then he answered questions for another hour plus, and then he signed books. And that started some dialogues through the community. We had prepared for that. But those dialogues waned. And then back in the early part of the 2000s, when Bill Johnson became mayor, we started he started the biracial partnership program, which connected people across racial lines. And we had, some very successful conversations across racial lines of leaders in this community, including the former president of Nazareth College, Dr. Braithman. Things changed. A new mayor came into play and defunded the really not big budget for the biracial partners, and some of the faces changed, and so that went away. We continue in our living of these days to try to bridge what has been a gap. The violence that we see, the deaths of people of color at the hands of police, as Dr. Sim said, is not new. It is not new. The thing is, now they're being captured on cell phones and police body-worn cameras. But those things have been happening. That was something that, my father would tell me as I was growing up, and I, tried to pass that along to my own sons as they were growing up, is that no matter what you do, you're going to be judged differently. And so my father told me that, it depends on, how you carry yourself. And he said his words, I don't have much to give you, but I give you a good name. Hargrave is the name, he said. And that name, when you go out in the community, you represent this family. And so he said, and he told me this, that when you are in a world that is dominated by whites, you have to be twice as good to not even be considered even. And so that was part of my conversation with him. That's the way I've tried to live my life. That's the way I've tried to present myself as someone who can do what needs to be done. My lament, as I said, I'm the oldest of this group, is that the more we seem to make forward movement, the more, if we look closely, things tend to back up. And so the time that I have left on this planet, I'm still trying to do that reaching across to try and come to a better understanding. But my thing is that I'm a Christian. I believe that we are all open to redemption. We're all open to God's grace. But my lament is that even when a human being is shown being killed by police on camera, that some of my white colleagues still don't feel that that is their problem also. So thanks for the time.
Good afternoon. My name is Julie Welch, and I am a graduate student here at Nazareth College, studying voice performance and pedagogy. This is my second year working at the Hickey Center as a graduate assistant. This afternoon, I'm honored to welcome Rabbi Peter Stein back to the Hickey Center. Rabbi Peter Stein is the senior rabbi of Temple B'rith Kodesh. Rabbi Stein has a commitment to social justice work and interfaith endeavors. He is a proud member of Planned Parenthood's National Clergy Advocacy Board. In 2015, he walked in Alabama and Georgia as part of the NAACP Journey for Justice, and he has a long-standing engagement with issues of LGBTQ equality and poverty. He has been involved in significant relationships with the Catholic, Christian, and Muslim communities. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Stein.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Thank you, Dr. Shafiq, and to my fellow presenters. I'm truly honored and humbled to be with you this afternoon. I'm really grateful for the chance to learn. I come today with prayers in my heart for justice and peace in our city, speaking, I hope, to add honor to the memory of Daniel Prude, and prayers in my heart for peace and safety for all those who are taking action towards equality. I come this afternoon to share a few reflections from the Jewish perspective, from Jewish history and Jewish theology, that leads us to a commitment, a deep and abiding commitment to the work of racial justice. I come from a family that lost members in the Holocaust. I come from a family typical of so many American Jewish families that faced quotas, that faced housing restrictions, that faced discrimination in so many different ways. So from a personal perspective, I certainly share in the hopes that there will be equality for one and all. What I want to do is share sort of a couple of different snapshots, if you will, beginning with a little bit of biblical foundation and then some more modern perspective. And as the program progresses, naturally, I'll be happy to answer questions and round out the Jewish perspective in any way that is desired. So if we look back to the Hebrew Bible, to the books of the Old Testament, there are several different foundational texts that lead to these commitments. The first, of course, in the creation story is the lesson that every human being is created, B'Tselem Elohim is the Hebrew, in the divine image. And this leads to a really profound, radical commitment that every person we approach in this world, every person we meet, every person that we see should be viewed as being created in the divine image, as worthy of dignity and respect, as worthy of safety and opportunity. And I always carry with me the lesson of my teacher, Rabbi Eugene Borowitz, who taught me this lesson about this text, about remembering that every single person is created in the divine image, almost, he said, as a spiritual practice. When you're walking down the street or in the big cities, perhaps sitting on the subway, look at every single person you see, no matter how they present, and say to yourself, created in the image of God, created in the image of God, created in the image of God. So that really becomes a foundation from the creation story. Other texts we can turn to are the command that says, love your neighbor as yourself. And also, you shall not stand idly by the blood of your neighbors. So these texts charge us really to wake up each day and see who is not receiving the love, who is not having their blood taken seriously. I also, when I think of biblical foundations, there's another textual tradition, another piece of our sacred foundation that leads us to these commitments. And it comes from the understanding of the story of the Egyptian slavery, the ancient Israelites who were enslaved in Egypt for over 400 years. And upon being led to freedom by Moses and Miriam, the commands that were given and were then carried out by the later interpreters of the Bible, the early rabbis, to say that when we remember the story of what happened in Egypt, in every generation, we should view it as if we ourselves were in Egypt, that we ourselves were oppressed. So when we look at oppression in the world today, it is not happening to the other, it is happening to us. It is happening to our brothers and our sisters. And so the issues of racial justice, of abuse and violence and hatred, which are taking over our city and taking over our country today, the Jewish answer is no, this is not acceptable, because these are human beings created in the image of God, because these are our neighbors, our brothers and our sisters, and because we carry in a very real way the memory of what it means to be oppressed, to be attacked, and to be discriminated against. With that little bit of a foundation, if we advance forward, it is very clear from the historical record that anti-Semitism and racism have a very tragic history of being intertwined. Where there is anti-Semitism, racism is not far behind. Where there is racism, anti-Semitism is not far behind. If we think of modern events, modern moments in our own country, we recognize the great tragedy, the violence at Mother Emanuel Church, which shortly after then was followed by the violence and the tragedy at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. When there's racism, there's anti-Semitism. When there's anti-Semitism, there's racism. We know that none of us can say this is something that is happening to others and somehow we are immune. Another example from our own time, of course, is the violence that happened in Charlottesville, where one protester shouted the most profane words of racism, and the next protester shouted the most profane words of anti-Semitism, back and forth and back and forth. And so I am not unique. I am not alone in any way in the commitment to the work of combating racism and creating racial justice in our country, to be an ally, to be a supporter, to build the relationships, most importantly, with those in the Black community so that I can learn from them and be led by them and be guided by them. Just a couple of other points really of history and context. I am part of the National Reform Jewish Movement, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, and there is a very long history of sort of formal statements, platforms, if you will, that articulate a commitment to racial justice. And these go back really throughout the 20th century. And just as examples of the formal language that is there, there's a commitment to combating income equality, to restoring and preserving voting rights, to restoring educational equality, to eliminating mass incarceration, to ending racial profiling, to reforming police practices. And all of these and more are the work that we, my colleagues and I, hold out as significant, and I hold out as part of our commitment here in Rochester. The last point I'd like to raise, comment I'd like to make, is what is happening here in Rochester. We at Temple B'rith Kodesh and the members of the other synagogues in Rochester are prepared and anxious to take action. We've had very important dialogue over the last months. In particular, how can we respond to the events in Rochester? So it is a commitment that we have, a commitment that we are prepared to act on, whether it's right now or in the future. And I look forward to the questions and conversation as our program continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Stein. Our final panelist this afternoon is Dr. Irshad Altheimer. Irshad Altheimer is the executive director and co-founder of Baraka Muslim Charity. He has nearly 20 years of leadership experience in the American Muslim community. He accepted Islam in December 2000 while attending graduate school at Washington State University. Shortly therefore, he served as the MSA Vice President and President and Representative. Upon completion of his doctorate, Irshad moved to Detroit, Michigan, where he remained active in the Muslim community. He served as the faculty advisor for the Wayne State University Muslim Student Associate. He also served on the board of the Wayne State University Mosque, the MSA Quran Institute, CAIR Michigan, and the Family and Youth Institute. Additionally, Irshad was the co-founder and president of the Islamic Health and Healing Service, which provide weekly meals to the homeless population of Detroit. Irshad moved to Rochester in 2012. Shortly thereafter, he co-founded Baraka Muslim Charity. In addition to his work at BMC, Irshad is frequently speaking at local area mosques. He also served as the IIIT faculty advisor for the Muslim Student Associate.
I would like to thank all of you for welcoming me to this platform. I feel honored to be here with you tonight at this important time. I want to begin by first thanking God and praising Him and sending blessings upon the prophets and the righteous and those who follow them. And I want to also go and really contemplate just some of the Islamic texts. And we have been discussing these issues in the American Muslim community, and these texts have been providing us guidance for thinking about how we can navigate this issue. Are the issues that we challenge, that we face, these challenges that we face around racism and injustice in our society. The first thing I want to do is quote the verse from the Quran that comes from chapter 49, verse 22, that says, "O mankind, we have created you from a male and a female and made you into nations and tribes that you may know one another. Verily the most honorable of you with God is the one who has God consciousness. Verily God is all-knowing and all-aware." And this represents one of the themes in the Quran that deals with the diversity of mankind as something that should be embraced, something that we should see as a blessing. In another verse, The Quran tells us, and of his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your languages and your colors. Indeed, in that are signs for those who have knowledge. And that is chapter 30, verse 22. And so there's no need for us to say, you know, I don't see color or be colorblind to deal with the issues of racism. We can acknowledge that we have different ethnicities and languages, and we can see them as something that's a blessing, as something that should cause us to reflect, and something that should cause us to appreciate, it should be a source of appreciation. Also, I think we should recognize the failings of our society in regards to this issue of race and ethnicity and respect for diversity. And as we seek to challenge ourselves to be open-minded about these issues and to embrace diversity, we must also ensure that our institutions reflect these values, that the places that we work, our school districts, our jobs, our colleges, our police departments, don't become institutions that perpetuate racism and white supremacy. We must demand that our institutions value life in all of its forms. We must ensure that our institutions do not carry out racism. We must make sure that our institutions believe that Black lives matter. And I think this is something that is really important as we reflect on this current time and this current set of challenges that we're facing, is that it's one thing for us as individuals to have a clear heart, but it's another thing for us to make sure that our institutions don't carry out racism. In addition to my work in the Muslim community, I have a PhD in sociology, and one of the famous race scholars in sociology said that we're living in an era of racism without racist. And what he was commenting on is that we can have a situation where everyone can have a clear heart. Everyone can say, you know, I don't have a problem with this group of people. I don't have a problem with Blacks or Latinos, for instance, but they can sit there idly and pretend to not see the fact that our systems can perpetuate racism, even if we claim not to be racist ourselves. The second thing I want us to think about just briefly is this notion of justice. And I think justice is something that we all like when it comes to the other person or the other group. But justice should be something that we embrace under all circumstances. The Quran says, "O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to God, even though it be against yourselves or your parents or your kin. Be he rich or poor, God is a better protector to both than you. So follow not the lust of your hearts, lest you may avoid justice. And if you distort your witness or refuse to give it, then verily God is ever acquainted with what you do." And that makes me really reflect upon this issue of what it really means to have justice in a society as diverse as ours, as complex as ours. And what does it mean to ensure that the poor man gets the same justice as the rich man, and that the white man gets, the Black man gets the same justice as the white man? One of the painful things, really painful things about seeing excerpts of the city's report about the Daniel Prude case is how easy it was for city officials to seemingly come to the conclusion that Daniel Prude absolutely had no value whatsoever. And what really hurt me with the Daniel Prude case is that Baraka Muslim Charity, our charity, is on Jefferson Avenue. It's 3 blocks from where Daniel Prude was killed. And what really hurt me so much about this case, there are many factors, but there are people who are on Jefferson Avenue that we deal with all the time. We feed them, we take care of the community. And the fact that our people working in one of our most important institutions couldn't see his humanity at that time really is troubling for me and for a lot of people. And so justice is very important. 2 more points. I know I have short time, so I'll make 2 more points and then I'll close. The last thing I want to remind all of us is that we cannot build walls high enough to avoid these problems. We are all on the same ship. There's a famous saying by the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. He said, the parable of those who respect the limits of God and those who violate them is that of the people who board a ship after casting lots, some of them residing in its upper deck and others in its lower deck. When those in the lower deck want water, they pass by the upper deck and say, if we tear a hole in the bottom of the ship, we will not harm those above us. If those in the upper deck let them do what they want, they will all be destroyed together. If they restrain them, they will all be saved together. Whether we like it or not, we're on the same ship. And if we let injustice ruin our society, we're all going to deal with the consequences in our children. Before I came here, I was driving, and I live in Irondequoit. I took my kids to the library, and I noticed that it was a very hazy day. And I looked up, I looked over to my son, and I said, "Do you know what that is? That hazy sky that you see?" He said, "What is that?" I said, "That is the smoke blowing all the way over from the West Coast. Thousands, the fires from thousands of miles away are now clouding our sun here in Rochester." And I think injustice works the same way. We have a tendency in our society to, due to segregation and other things, to think that we can get away from these problems, or we can build a wall, we can build a barrier, but we're all on the same ship. And so that means we all have the collective obligation to try to fix this issue and work towards addressing it so that we can all sail peacefully together. The final thing I want to say is that I think that one of the things that we have to all be very concerned about in these times of national tension and friction is how it affects how we look at other people. And it affects how sometimes when you see in the news, for instance, someone being mistreated or a Black man being mistreated, how it causes you to deal with other people. And I think all of us should know that while we fight for justice, it is true that everyone in our society is redeemable, and we should not forget mutual kindness with each other. We should still, as we fight for as we move for reconciliation and we demand justice, we should always remember to try to have mutual kindness between each other. And I'll end with this last verse in the Quran. It says, "The good deed and the evil deed cannot be equal. Repel the evil deed with one which is better. Then verily he between whom there was enmity will become as though he was a close friend." So I think that as we fight for justice on the kind of macro level and we challenge our society to do better, and we hold our officials accountable, we hold ourselves accountable, let us not forget mutual kindness between each other as we deal with each other, people from different groups and from different backgrounds. Thank you.
Dr. King, this is Angela Sims. I don't subscribe to nihilism. So for me, there is always a measure of hope. We're called to look for it. And it means too that one of the things I really appreciated about Rabbi Stein's comments was this notion of recognizing the full humanity of all people. And that we can recognize the full humanity of a person and still name the evil for what the evil is. And you already talked about listening. Well, listening is something that's acquired. It's an art. And so I think the more people allow themselves to listen and to be uncomfortable perhaps with what they're hearing and to go back and to process why they're uncomfortable with it, it might lend itself to all of us being able to be just open a little bit more to the possibilities of human and community transformation. So I make the distinction between individuals who practice a type of hybridity, recognizing that religion for me is one's worldview, but that if one says that one both subscribes to quote unquote Christian principles, whatever those might be, but also subscribes to the tenets of white supremacy, I've begun to name that as white supremacy Christianity. At the same time, one can be an advocate or proponent of white supremacy and not be aligned with any type of faith tradition.
I guess I can respond to that. There's an old saying that says, children learn what they live. And they learn from their parents they learn hate from their parents. I think all of our faith traditions view children as being born pure, but they learn from their parents. I want to add something else that has not been talked about because of what's happened with the police. But it was 1971, September of 1971. And I guess most people around here, either on here weren't around or aren't old enough. But there was what was called a riot at Attica Prison. And the prisoners took over the prison. They held the guards captive. And after, I think it was 5 days, there was a team of both ministers and others, some politicians, who were negotiating a surrender on the part of the prisoners. And the word came from that time Governor Nelson Rockefeller, because he wanted to be president. He wanted to show that he was a law and order president. He was a candidate. He wasn't elected, but he wanted to be a candidate. And so he told the state police to take over the prison. And so what happened was a massacre. State police, some of the Genesee County sheriffs, some guards who went and got their own weapons, just shot down both prisoners and some of their own colleagues. The guards were killed by state police, sheriffs, and other prison guards. The word first came out that the prisoners had done the killing, but the prisoners had no guns. That was 1971, and no one was held to account for the deaths of all those people. There have been several books written about it, but when we think that what is happening with law enforcement, and I say this as someone who has family who are in law enforcement, someone who's, some of my lifelong friends, one of my lifelong friends became the first black head of the New York State Police. He passed away a year and a half ago. But we still have a long way to go to holding law enforcement to account for the deaths of people who are, for most part, not sentenced to death.
And I'll try to keep it short. One of the tragedies about Attica is that some information is still suppressed and the full record still hasn't even been revealed. And I think one of the ways that our society deals with these tragedies is to bury them so deep that it will take generations to be able to even understand what happened. And so thank you for noting that, because it's part of a long history of suppressing important information. And when it comes to a government abuse, our government mistreatment of people of minorities status, particularly African Americans. So thank you for sharing that.
So to my knowledge, I believe that is already occurring. They have been gathering almost nightly, and some have taken the stands over the last 4 to 5 days where the older clergy members are actually on the front line to allow the Black Lives Matter protesters and others to be somewhat shielded from the police force?
I would just add that I think the religious clergy have a unique opportunity to reach people in ways that in forums that a lot of other people don't have. And so I think in addition to protests and at religious institutions and in addition in private counsel also, religious leaders are in a unique position to shape people's opinions about these issues and help them think through the complexity of them. And also it's important, I think even more importantly than being at the protest, is engaging their own congregations and in private conversations, because these are people that are trusted. And there's an old saying that, people don't care what you know until they know that you care, right? And so I think that position of trust puts religious leaders in the community in a great position to really shape attitudes in our society.
I would just add, really building on both comments, the questions about protests and the questions about the next generations, a combination of two things. One is I've been greatly influenced, as so many of us have, by the writing of Ibram Kendi and the concept of anti-racism, that when we talk about children being born pure and where do they learn these things, it's not enough for any of us to simply say we're not racist. It's not enough for any of us to simply say we're not hating. We have to go to the more active place of being anti-racist, actively combating it. And I think what is so closely tied to that, especially when we look in Rochester, is this incredibly segregated city that we're living in. And if we don't combat and dismantle that segregation in terms of race and in terms of economics, both, then we're not building the relationships to truly make a change and truly change how our city and how our country is functioning. So that's the way I approach it, both in terms of whether it's a protest or another action, and also how we can impact the next generation.
So one thing, Rabbi Stein, you are there, and many people I see here are mostly involved in the interfaith work in the city and outside also. I see quite a few faces who are very active in the interfaith work. It came to, I was thinking about that also, but when Reverend Hargrave was speaking, I thought there is a gap in the interfaith work now. We need to be more actively involved, and we need to be on the street as interfaith leaders, as interfaith community workers, to stand together and see what is happening in our city and why it is happening in our city. So I think it's a challenge for us that this work of interfaith, which we are all devoted to it, which we are doing, why this can happen in our city. So we need to look deeper, all of you who are interfaith leaders, workers, and that way to look deeper into ourselves, what we are lacking. Are we doing our work really how we started before in Rochester City? Are we doing that work? So let's think over it, and let's, I think it's time again to see if Rena Raina could be reactivated, other interfaith, how we can all join together and see that we can demonstrate and show that how as one people we stand together. There is no black, white, yellow, brown. There is all of us who are religious. We are one together. We are all, and we stand together when, whatever happens in our city, and it should not happen in our city, we should do that necessary training, necessary education to our community, including police force is more important to do the training and of diversity and interfaith to them. Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Sam, Dr. Lois Hargrave, and Rabbi Peter Stein, Dr. Irshad Altheimer, for sharing your thoughts with all of us. And to all who are present here, thank you for, getting out of your precious timings and works and spending it with us and being with us. I'm really thankful to all of you. Hopefully we will have new series, which we will announce it very soon. Soon the high holidays are over. We'll come up with some new series to announce around the issue of social justice. racism, how humanity is treated by some. So we will do that. Thank you. And thank you all. I appreciate your participation. Thank you. And have a good evening, good night.